Hi there, my name is Alexandra Heller-Nicholas and I'm a film critic, author, and recovering academic who's published 9 books on cult, horror, and exploitation film, including 3 books on rape revenge movies. Now, one of these books is about Abel Ferrara's Miss 45, and the other 2 are my 2011 book, Rape Revenge Films, A Critical Study, and the heavily revised 10-year anniversary edition of that same book, which features a whole new chapter on women-directed rape revenge movies. Anyway, this is all to say that this movie that we're now watching is very much in my wheelhouse. Clearly, to say that is a bit of an understatement, as obviously goes without saying, this film is considered very much a key text in the rape revenge film category. I'm going to dig quite broadly, I guess, in this commentary. I'm going to focus on, the bigger picture regarding how thriller fits into the complex landscape of rape revenge film more generally. But of course, I'll also be talking more specifically about this film itself. Before we get stuck into that, however, I do want to talk about these extraordinary opening moments of the film, because to me it's just some absolutely incredible filmmaking, and in fact really lays down some of the key stylistic elements or foundations that run through the film almost like a drum beat, and actually do some pretty heavy lifting on the structural front. Most obviously, of course, we have that incredible opening shot of the police car traveling towards the camera right at the beginning. And the film is bookended by this because, of course, at the end of the film, we have the post-vengeance Madeleine herself driving away from the camera as the film finishes. There's a tension here that I just love between what at first seems to be very simple, the law arriving, the law leaving, but it's actually, of course, much more complex than it first appears. The whole point of this film, like so many other rape revenge movies, is that it complicates notions of what justice is and how it can be effective, and in particular where in gender-based violence and sex crimes, the institutions representing the law and justice are broadly so ineffective. There's a real ambivalence at best that permeates these kinds of films about things like the police, and we see that so much in this movie, where later in the film Madeleine taking on the cops is just as logical to her as taking on those who abused and oppressed her. She makes no distinction between them, for reasons, of course, that we find out about here at the start of the film. So, of course, the movie begins with the quite shocking, clearly very shocking sexual assault of Madeleine by a pedophile, and we find out through 2 local women shortly that the perpetrator was never published? Ha! How many books did he write? The perpetrator was never punished because of an insanity defense. So long before she meets Tony then, Madeleine and indeed her family have every reason in the world to believe that on a very basic level, sexual violence is not taken seriously by the police, by the judiciary, and that if the rape of a child can go unpunished, it's actually fair to expect that the sexual exploitation and assault of an older girl, of a young woman, will be even more so. So before I get into all of this further, however, I do really want to just turn your attention to what for me is one of the major visual motifs in this film, or certainly one of the most striking. And it's that extraordinary use of a really beautiful autumnal colour palette that we just saw in that opening sequence. These beautiful yellows and oranges and reds and browns and greens. They really riddle not just these earlier scenes in the films, but key locations such as Tony's apartment when Madeleine first arrives there. Now, just on an aesthetic level, this is really gorgeous filmmaking, and there are key moments near the end of the film that I think are equally as breathtaking, just in a purely formal sense. Those beautiful slow-motion fight sequences that almost look like they're shot underwater. Now, to state the obvious, and I'll dig into this a lot more throughout the commentary, of course, this sits in a very fraught, intense tension with some of the more graphic moments in this movie, which of course is especially visible in the longer hardcore cut of the film. But we might keep away from that for a moment. I do love the return, I guess, to these autumnal hues throughout the movie. And again, aside from just looking beautiful, I do think that there is a bit of a thematic parallel there too. Obviously, this idea, I guess, that this is a period of transition, of going from the brightness of cheer of summer through fall to the bleakness and coldness and barrenness of winter. It's not too hard to see both the scene of child Madeleine's sexual assault and later what happens to her in Tony's apartment as transitional moments that follow this same pattern. That she goes from a place of relative happiness to something much bleaker. It's really nice filmmaking here. But it also really marks from the outset the idea of Madeleine as a child of nature And those early close-ups of her with the leaves, there's really nice wardrobing choices in this film. I'm thinking of the scene where she gives the older women the milk, and we have that nice little parallel between the white sweater that she wears and the milk that she pours out. There is then a really conscious effort, I think, especially in the first part of this film. And again, we see this sort of bookended where the film finishes up, linking Madeline to the world of the natural, and that she is abducted and forced into the world of the urban, the very unnatural, I think in itself can be understood as a kind of symbolic violence.
Madeleine. Madeleine, det är bäst att du skyndar dig på nu så att du hinner med bussen som går klockan 4. Du har ju inte varit ledig på en månad nu.
Kan du ge mig ett enda argument varför du inte skulle följa med mig till stan? Hej, Tony heter jag. Käka upp mig på den här kärran idag. Skön va? 3000 GT. 157 hästar. 0 till 100 på 8,5. Toppa på över 200.
Okay, with a film like this that has such a strong cult reputation, it's almost hard to know really where to begin. So, as I said, I do want to go broader here and focus on where this movie fits into the wider rape revenge film history, but also to drill down into some of the more nuanced elements of the film itself. But to start with, I figure it may not hurt just to give a brief overview of how I approach this movie in my book on rape revenge film. Now, my analysis appears in a chapter called The Rape Revenge Canon, which focuses on the big ones, the famous ones. And I also very deliberately threw a couple of curveballs in there with films that are perhaps not considered to be rape revenge films, but that I feel really do lock in quite explicitly to this cinematic tradition, stuff like Extremities. Anyway, so I break this rape revenge canon down to exploitation film examples, mainstream examples, and in particular those that focus on masculinity. The latter is important just because, because of word count limitations that you get with a book, you can't do everything, right? So my book really only focused on instances where women are assaulted. I want to be really clear here, just this isn't totally relevant to this film, but I do think it's really important when we talk about rape revenge in general, just to keep in mind that this is not reflective of cinema more broadly, but more importantly, that it's not really representative of the real world either. Male sexual assault survivors are far too often ignored, actually, in these discussions, and it's something that I do consciously take great pains to avoid doing, because I know just anecdotally, right, through mates, that a number of male survivors are actually drawn to films like this as much as women survivors as a kind of catharsis, which I genuinely can say, like having, worked on this stuff for well over a decade now, just based on, talking to the people that I've met, this idea of catharsis and rape revenge films for survivors is probably a lot more common or widespread than some people might think. So, and this is for both men and women. So I just, there are definitely going to be survivors listening to this, and I welcome you. These films are for you as much as they are for anybody else. Do what you need to do. I see you, I acknowledge you, and if these films help you in some way as a survivor, just know that you're not alone. Anyway, back to rape revenge and the rape revenge film canon. Alongside thriller in the exploitation film category, I have movies like, the obvious ones. You guys can guess this. It's like I Spit on Your Grave, Ms. 45, Last House on the Left. They're the sort of obvious ones here, I guess. There's clearly a very highbrow, lowbrow tension going on here, right? But there is perhaps, I guess, a curious coincidence that this supposed binary between highbrow and lowbrow films in all of these instances is actually not as clear-cut as we might think. And most obvious here, I guess, is the factoid that everybody knows, that European art house darling Ingmar Bergman comes into play here in a big way. Now, most obviously that is through Last House on the Left, which was a reimagining and an updating of the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman's Oscar-winning 1960 film The Virgin Spring. But what is perhaps less known is that the director of this film, who's a guy called Bo-Arne, I knew I'd screwed up his name, sorry, Bo-Arne Verbenius, worked with Bergman on what I consider two of Bergman's best films, and I know I'm not alone there. Verbenius worked as an assistant director on Bergman's Persona in 1966, and a unit director on probably one of the greatest Euro horror films and great art horror films of all time, not just in Sweden, not just in Europe. Bergman's Hour of the Wolf from 1968. So Verbenius worked on both of those films with Bergman. This was certainly by no means his first time working on a film set. So for the purposes of my book, it was useful to make a distinction between exploitation rape revenge films and more mainstream and art house rape revenge films. But as I've said already, this does not mean that the latter are necessarily more enlightened than the former, not by any stretch. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I find this category so very interesting. I'd also add in passing, and again, this may be something I unpack further later, that this is not the only way that you can categorize rape revenge films. We can also look at those where a woman who has been raped or sexually assaulted is herself the avenging figure, or those where someone else, usually a man, is acting on her behalf as a kind of agent. Now, for perhaps very obvious reasons, there's clearly some major gender political significance there, depending on which model a film takes us. Who is doing the revenge? Are they doing it for themselves? Are they doing it for someone else? Is it a man looking after a woman? Obviously that's where things start to get complicated on the gender political front. But another really useful way I find of thinking about different types of rape revenge films is where they stand on the idea of revenge as a kind of fantasy. Do they, like I Spit on Your Grave, end on a final note where revenge is like a punctuating act of violence that sort of balances the scales of justice, if you like, very much supporting this eye for an eye idea of justice? Not all rape revenge films do this. There is an assumption, an incorrect assumption, that that's what they do, that the rape revenge films sort of maintain this fantasy, which is just factually incorrect. You only need to look at something like Ms. 45 or a more recent rape revenge film like Violation. There's so many of these, I would say is actually as many in the first category, that completely undermine that fantasy and totally expose it as toxic. And again, if you approach these films in this way, you actually start beginning to see how complicated the broader category is. But that these films are so often dismissed as being all the same, it's when you start thinking about it, it's actually just not true. They're actually extremely diverse. They often have very opposing visions or views just on the very ethics of revenge itself. Is it a fantasy, or is it something that the film is critiquing? I'll get back to that later in the commentary about Thriller in particular, because I do think this film has a very easily missed relationship to those questions. Anyway, I want to go back to my book on rape revenge and just read very briefly here some excerpts about what I wrote about this film. I wrote this first thing, as I said, in 2011, 2009, and then it was published in 2011. So maybe, yeah, I wrote it in 2009, 2010. Anyway, I digress. All right. As The Virgin Spring and Last House on the Left demonstrate, rape revenge films run the gamut of cinematic artistry. This is nowhere clearer than in Thriller: A Cruel Picture, a fascinating example that demonstrates simultaneous levels of both aesthetic exquisiteness and an unflinching poverty of craftsmanship. Banned twice, even in its liberal homeland of Sweden, Thriller was shot into the public imagination when its protagonist's iconic eye patch was referenced by Elle Driver, played by Daryl Hannah, in Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. The more beautiful moments of the film, and the film does contain instances of genuinely breathtaking filmmaking, suggest that the time that Verbenius spent working with Ingmar Bergman on Hour and the Wolf and Persona was not wasted. But at the same time, the extended hardcore version of Thriller: A Cruel Picture also exhibits moments of pure exploitation filmmaking at its most morally bankrupt. This glaring paradox makes viewing the film an even more strange and confusing task than that entailed by almost all other rape revenge films. The film begins with the carefree frolicking of a little girl playing in autumn leaves. Spun around in the air by an elderly man, the scene turns from idyllic to ugly when interrupted by a close-up of his contorted, grotesque face that, when combined with a shot of her crumpled, discarded clothing, implies that the child has been raped. The police capture the unnamed man, but cutting to Madeline Christina Lindberg as a young woman, two elderly female neighbours discuss how the assault resulted in Madeline's muteness and that the perpetrator went unpunished. Dedicated to her parents and her life on the farm, her father encourages Madeline to take some time off and go into town. The fashionable young Tony picks her up after she misses her bus and takes her to a fancy restaurant. He invites her back to his apartment and drugs her. While she is unconscious, he announces in a telephone call that she is the 5th girl he has captured in this manner this year, and when she wakes up, Madeline is informed that she is now addicted to heroin and must work as a sex worker for him to keep receiving drugs. Pretending to be Madeline, Tony writes unkind letters to her parents who, grief-stricken, soon suicide. Tony's clients begin to arrive, and Madeline scratches the eyes of the first one when he approaches her for sex. Famously, Tony retaliates by cutting out one of her eyes, requiring the addition of her famous eye patch. After the discovery of her parents' death, Madeline goes to church and uses extra money she gains from raising her rates to learn karate, how to shoot, and how to drive. Her drug abuse and use continues, but when her colleague Sally is murdered, Madeline begins her revenge by tracking down her clients and killing them. Challenging Tony to a duel, she enacts an elaborate murder, and the film ends when he dies and she drives away from his corpse. We assume. Thriller: A Cruel Picture's extreme reputation stems primarily from its graphic eye-gouging scene. The rumour that Verbenius used an actual corpse and that what the film showed was a real human eye being punctured with a scalpel became an integral part of the film's notoriety. While unarguably disturbing to a spectator with undeveloped gore literacy skills, for those of us familiar with eyeball-heavy film violence, spanning from Louis Buñuel's 1929 film Un Chien Andalou to the work of Italian director Lucio Fulci, the scene is not particularly exceptional. Far harder to dismiss, however, is the hardcore pornographic inserts that feature in a longer version of the movie. Thriller: A Cruel Picture is, of course, not the only film to fall under the broader adult rubric to incorporate rape revenge elements. While it would be a major task that falls well outside the parameters of this book to assess the wider application of rape in adult film, some of the more notorious rape revenge examples from this era also include Emmanuel's Revenge, The Taking of Christina, Terry's Revenge, and Forced Entry. Although Thriller's brief pornographic close-ups featuring explicit penetration are on their own non-violent, the context of their placement within the telling of Madeline's story render them profoundly violent indeed. In an interview with Cinema Sure's Jan Brun, Verbenius is open about doing the film to make money, stating that he needed to recuperate financial losses from an earlier project and thus, quote, decided to make the most commercial film ever made. On the inclusion of these hardcore inserts, he notes that they were only included to profit on the increasing, quote, liberalization of porn in Denmark and Sweden at the time. While it is impossible to transcend an analysis of Thriller beyond the nasty commercial reality that its hardcore inserts belie, the crushing ugliness of these moments make the film's strengths even more conspicuous by comparison. Verbinius himself has put it, looking back on it, it's a shitty film, but with interesting aspects to it. Not the least of these, of course, is the performance of Christina Lindberg. Although in her mid-20s at the time Thriller was made, Lindberg was making softcore films around this period that emphasised her youth, such as Joseph W. Sano's Swedish Wildcats and Walter Buser's The Swinging Coeds in 1972, and Torgny Wickman's Swedish Nymphette and Ernst Hofbauer's Secrets of Sweet 16 in 1973. Part of the decision to include these hardcore inserts no doubt stemmed from the fact that Lindberg's fans at the time may have wanted a more traditional erotic aspect to her performance. But as the mute Madeleine, her ability to communicate her character's experiences without words is flawless. When her clumsy fingernails fumble with syringes and tourniquets, Madeleine's innocence is suffocating, and paralleled on-screen surely only by Nacho Bronkhorst's performance as the title character of Uli Edel's Christian F. from 1981. Lindberg makes it feasible that Madeleine is the kind of woman capable of soaring off her own shotgun, a powerful metaphor for castration. Dressed similarly to Miko Kaji's rape-avenging protagonist in Female Prisoner 701 Scorpion, Lindberg's performance as rampaging Madeleine is nuanced, desperate and sympathetic, as much as that of her Japanese counterpart. All right, so I wrote that over 10 years ago, and while I obviously stand by it, what I do find interesting revisiting it, I guess, is about tone. Right, when you write a book like that, you're using a very kind of different tone, I guess, than you use for a commentary track like this. And I do fear that it does come across as a little broadly anti-pornography in tone. And I really want to spell this out, that this is not the case. And I actually do think this is worth talking about. I actually saw this film, the version with the hardcore inserts, for the first time on the same day, back to back really, with Jess Franco's Doriana Gray, and that also had the version with the hardcore inserts. So as I said, like films that would do that would have like a kind of a shorter cut and then have a longer cut with hardcore inserts. Clearly, not unusual, and certainly not unique to this film on its own. But I hope I'm stating the obvious here. There's a pretty big difference when you have hardcore inserts in a rape revenge film and when you have them in a film that's more focused on consensual, intimate encounters. If you put hardcore inserts in a rape revenge film, you don't get the right to say, "Oh no, we're not being exploitative." We're sort of talking about a real social issue. Like clearly, I mean, the director of this was like, "Yeah, we totally wanted to make money," and I kind of admired that honesty. I mean, it's pretty offensive. You don't putting hardcore inserts in a rape revenge film. I personally think perhaps is not cool. But at the same time, I do really think I kind of admire the honesty, because there's a lot of exploitation rape revenge films where it's actually really obvious that that's what they're doing, right? They are exploitation films. But in fact, and I'm not going to name names here, but there's some quite famous ones where the filmmakers have come out and sort of, thump their chest and it's like, no, I'm really noble. I'm doing this because I really care about the issues. But, you hear people that have worked with those people and it's like, nah, they wanted to make money. So I actually do like I said, I do kind of admire the fact that that this film was sort of very clear in its intentions, regardless of how personally tasteful I find that. I just appreciate that nobody's trying to bullshit me with their pompous, performative, look at how socially minded I am stuff. Anyway, whatever flies your kite. I mean, this is a judgment-free zone. I would like to think that most people who are into porn perhaps, see the difference between hardcore porn and using hardcore porn in the context of a film about sexual violence. I'm not going to go more into this. I'm sure you have your own feelings about it. I don't want to, give anybody a hard time, but I do think that needs to be pointed out with the with the version of this film that does have the hardcore inserts in reference to that specifically.
Undertecknat Madeleine.
Min lilla vän. Nu börjar det verkliga livet. Du får 2 såna här om dagen om du gör som jag säger. Klockan 1 får du ditt första besök. Gör inga missar nu för då blir du utan. Kom in mig nu. Ska vi titta på ditt rum? Kamelen kommer om en liten stund. Var snäll emot honom.
Hej sötnos. Klä av dig nu.
Tony! Vad i helvete är det här för något? Fan ta det! När du förbrydar egentligen. Hur fan ska jag kunna komma hem till fru och se ut så här i ansiktet? Men du jävlar ska jag märka henne.
So, as you've probably figured out already, there is an enormous stuff to talk about, not just when it comes to this film specifically, but yeah, clearly how it fits into, the rape revenge category more broadly. One of the things that for me always strikes me when I revisit this film, and I'm actually giving you guys sort of insight into my my insecurities and failures, but this is something that I don't talk about in my book, and I think it's really major. So it's actually really nice to be able to do this commentary and to kind of dig my teeth into this a little bit, because I do think it was a really important thing that I left out. Is a really obvious way that this film deviates from what we might call the traditional or orthodox rape revenge film. As I noted here already, and in all my books on the subject, however, even the idea of a traditional or orthodox rape revenge film is a bit hazy. I mean, my whole point, and I'll talk about this a lot more later, the whole point that I push in all of my work on this subject is that these films are way too diverse and different and contradictory to really be narrowed down and understood and presented as like one singular unified whole. That being said, the basic structure for a rape revenge film is usually that a woman, and yes, it's almost always a woman, is sexually assaulted, and she either seeks revenge for herself or, as I said, somebody else will act on her behalf. That agent is often a man, as I previously noted, so it's a brother, father, partner, cop. But again, there are significant examples where the agent is another woman. It can be a mother, a sister, a friend, a cop, a lawyer. So at first sight here, we can surely clearly lock Thriller into the first category in that Madeleine is her own agent. She doesn't need somebody acting on her behalf to seek vengeance. She does it herself. She's a DIY kind of girl. So this all just completely throws out any claims that I Spit on Your Grave 5 years later was the first rape revenge film where a woman didn't have an agent to act on her behalf. I mean, it's just factually incorrect. But for me, what is much, much, much more interesting about this film is that we're actually talking about something much bigger and much different from quote unquote rape as it is sort of so usually configured in these movies. You know, the stranger in the stranger in the alley, the menacing figures who break into your house, etc. Instead, what Thriller does that not a lot of other rape revenge films do is that it deals quite explicitly with sex trafficking. Now, I want to be very clear here. It's not that what happens to Madeleine is sort of kind of like sex trafficking. It is sex trafficking. Now, I'm going to be a big nerd here, and I'm going to drop a bunch of definitions on you because I really want to punch this in. It's so important. I think if we really want to get a handle on the scale of what this film is doing and articulate why it's such a significant movie, we really need to understand how on this front it's very, very different from what most films we think of as being rape revenge films are doing. All right, this is from the United Nations. Quote, "The protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons defines trafficking in persons as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labour or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs." This film is about sex trafficking. I got more. I'm going to keep going through these. I'm going to make you believe this as strongly as I do. This is from the CDC website. Quote, "Sex trafficking is a type of human trafficking and is a form of modern-day slavery. It is a serious public health problem that negatively affects the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. Human trafficking occurs when a trafficker exploits an individual with force, fraud, or coercion to make them perform commercial sex or work. Sex trafficking is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 as the recruitment, harbouring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronising, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act. It involves the use of fraud, force, or coercion to make an adult engage in commercial sex acts." And look, one more for luck, just so this really is hammered home to you. This one is from the Department of Homeland Security's website, which states, quote, "Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labour or commercial sex act. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the United States. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. Traffickers might use violence, manipulation, or false promises of well-paying jobs or romantic relationships to lure victims into trafficking situations. Language barriers, fear of their traffickers, and or fear of law enforcement keep victims from seeking help, making human trafficking a hidden crime. Traffickers use force, fraud, or coercion to lure their victims and force them into labour or commercial sexual exploitation. They look for people who are susceptible for a variety of reasons, including psychological or emotional vulnerability, economic hardships, lack of a social safety net, natural disasters, or political instability. The trauma caused by the traffickers can be so great that many may not identify themselves as victims or ask for help, even in highly public settings." All right, Thriller's clearly not a documentary, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is like, gritty social realism here. But I really, 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 really want to push this. When you guys have finished this, if anybody asks you what you were doing today, just say you were researching human trafficking. You were looking to UN documentation, CDC, Department of Homeland Security. I'll back you. I'm here. Like, that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. You don't need excuses. Love what you love. I embrace it. I welcome you. I'm digressing here. I mean, look, the question is, why am I pushing this so hard? And I really do have a point here, right? So obviously rape, forced non-consensual sexual activity is a major part of what makes Madeleine's nightmarish journey what it is, right? But crucially, and I big capital letters, crucially, this exists as a clear aspect of her having been targeted by a sex trafficking ring, as understood by the very, very concise definitions that I've given you here. Very, very different from almost all other rape revenge films. There are others, and you guys might be thinking of some. One that comes to mind immediately is the 2015 rape revenge film, Even Lambs Have Teeth. So it's not the only film that is a rape revenge film that kind of steps into this space of sex trafficking. Clearly, there are others, but this is one that I think, I mean, this is really one of the most famous rape revenge films of all time. And it's often not talked about or conceived of in relation to these bigger issues. Um, so I guess what makes these films so notable is that on one hand, they absolutely have the narrative mechanics of rape revenge films, absolutely for sure, but they also, in varying degrees, are tackling something much bigger. You know, they focus quite explicitly on the economic exploitation of women. In this film, you know, the boss fights not with the clients, not with the clients that raped her, although they certainly get their comeuppance as they deserve. But of course, it's Tony. And we actually don't see Tony sexually assault Madeline as such. Rather, his monstrosity in the film comes from depriving her of her freedom and forcing her into sex work as part of what the film very overtly and aggressively configures as part of this bigger sex trafficking business. I mean, the guy fucking wears a suit for most of the film, right? So yes, we get a kick out of seeing Madeline destroy those who raped her. It is a rape revenge film, but the real highlight is seeing her go for Tony, and the extremity of how she goes for him is quite extraordinary. So yeah, I mean, he represents then not just sexual violence in the way that the orthodox or traditional rapist does in other rape revenge films. We actually find ourselves moving towards something similar, I think, in a lot of ways, and I'll talk about that later too. We're starting to move into something similar to Ms. 45, where the ultimate person that Thana kills, you know, the big person that she's going for is her boss. Now, he wasn't sexually abusing her, but he was sexually harassing her. He was a pig. I think, you know, objectively, the man was a pig. And if we look at the Thana's boss in Ms. 45 and we look at Tony here, we do see that these men represent something much, much bigger. They represent systemic violence against women. They sit well beyond the figure of just the rapist. You know, this idea that the rapist is like an individualized anomaly, just one bad egg, or like a group of bad eggs. They present themselves as part of a much, much bigger system. And the idea is that the system's broken. And of course, that system or framework, whatever you want to call it, is capitalism, right? You know, both here and in Ms. 45, it's about making money and exploiting women to make money. Now, I know I'm dwelling on this quite a bit here, but I just think it's really important to articulate this because, as I said, it's something that I haven't really gotten into before. And yeah, I think that it's really, really significant to acknowledge that this film in particular and Ms. 45, and again, you know, they're not alone, but you know that there are these really important rape revenge films that are thinking about bigger things. You know, they're looking at these systems in really interesting ways. And yeah, I think that when we reduce all rape revenge films to being the same thing, we just make such a big mistake. You know, we really undermine not just how the film's more generally, but a film such as this specifically, we really don't give it credit for the stuff that it's doing.
Det bara blir så här ibland. Jag kan inte rå för det. Du, jag såg att det fanns ett brev till dig uppe hos Tony. Jag snodde det när han inte såg mig.
Ett sånt fruktansvärt brev vi fick idag. Hur kan vår lilla Madeleine innehålla så mycket hat? Vad gjorde vi för fel? Du kunde väl ha rättat det som vi gjorde fel? Nu har vi ingenting att leva för längre. Vi är helt bedrövade över att vår lilla Madeleine kan innehålla så mycket hat. Efter alla de här fruktansvärda besvikelserna vill pappa och jag bara säga dig att du behöver inte vara rädd för att råka oss igen. Du, Madeleine, du var vårt allt. Madeleine, solstrålen i vårt liv. Adjö.
This is a good point, I think, to stop and talk about disability in the film, and how this fits into the bigger picture of rape revenge. And clearly I want to talk about here, I want to discuss this through the lens of Madeleine's muteness. The figure of the mute rape survivor has a really long history. And again, I want to read a little bit from my book about this. I'm going to go quite broad, but don't panic. I'm going to come back to this film and why this all matters. Quote, "From the story of Temple Drake to Fritz Lang's The Blue Gardenia, rape or attempted rape are not invisible in classical Hollywood cinema and often have key narrative functions. There are films from this era that are significant for their particular articulation of rape trauma rather than their union of rape and revenge. Most famous of these is Johnny Belinda, a film that adopts the motif of the mute female protagonist from The Spiral Staircase by Robert Siodmak from 1945, thus establishing the rape survivor as mute motif that can be seen in films ranging from Thriller, Miss 45, Savage Streets, Female Prisoner Scorpion, Lady Snowblood, The Demoniacs by Jean Rollin, and Speak by Jessica Schazer with Kristen Stewart from 2004. Johnny Belinda follows the story of a young doctor sent to a small village in Nova Scotia where he meets the deaf-mute farm girl Belinda. Inspired by her intelligence, he teaches her sign language and lip reading, and they develop a strong relationship. She is raped by a local guy called Lockie and soon discovers she is pregnant. Lockie decides he wants custody of the baby, and Belinda shoots him when he tries to take the child. During Lockie's murder trial, his wife Stella admits that Lockie raped Belinda and that he was there to take the baby. The film ends with Belinda's release, and she is romantically united with the doctor. While renowned as a key rape text from this period, in terms of classical Hollywood cause and effect logic, the rape is crucial only in that it leads to the birth of the child that propels the narrative tensions between the men in the last half of the film. The sequence where Belinda gives birth is much longer than the rape scene, and it is a relatively joyous affair. All right, so I wanted to quote that at length because Johnny Belinda is a really important film, I think, when we talk about things like muteness in rape revenge. Even when we look at something as specific as, rape films where the woman is a mute, there are, again, enormous differences in how that muteness functions in a kind of mechanical sense when it comes to things like, themes and narrative construction and just the general gender politics. So again, here we go, Miss 45. I wrote a whole book about Miss 45. I do have a bias, but obviously, there are very clear parallels between Miss 45 and Thriller especially. And I will eat my hat if Ferrara was not heavily influenced by this film. I'll touch on that more soon too. Miss 45 is really important here because the way that muteness functions in that film is really interesting, I think, because it's at different points of Miss 45, muteness is presented as both a weakness and a strength. When Thana is getting harassed at work or on the street, when she's getting sexually assaulted on the same afternoon, not once but twice, her literal inability to scream out are very much framed as a weakness. You know, her disability is a weakness. But when she's pushed over the edge and she becomes, you know, the kind of sexy avenging angel that we all know and love, her silence actually works towards configuring her as a kind of silent but deadly femme fatale. You know, that the silence really adds to this sort of broader mystique and this sort of seductive, mysterious nature. I don't say that as an attack on Miss 45. I wrote a book about it. I love the film. But it's so interesting, I think, to compare that to what's going on with Mutinous and Madeline and Thriller. Because here, Mutinous and femininity work in an extremely different way. What absolutely blows me away about Madeline's case and the way that Mutinous works here is that it actually doesn't do much. It's kind of neither here nor there. And when you compare it to something like Johnny Belinda or to Miss 45, and I think that's extraordinary. I think it's just extraordinary. When you think about it, it really doesn't make any difference to Madeline's life one way or another. I mean, you know, she could scream when she was with Tony, but, you know, Sally could scream. It didn't really help her. You know, we're told at the beginning of the film that her muteness is a result of trauma stemming from, you know, sexual assault when she was a child. But the film implies that this doesn't actually impact her relationship with her parents, which until Tony, you know, fucking around and sending nasty letters, you know, her relationship with her parents, we are led to believe, was very, very strong. So, you know, her muteness didn't impact her life in that sense. You know, she could work on the farm. She had this loving relationship. And even with Tony, you know, when he first meets her, obviously when he sees her on the street, he doesn't know that she's mute. But when he takes her out to dinner, he sort of jokes about it, but it's kind of really neither here nor there, one way or another. But at the same time, when she decides to start preparing for her escape and her retaliation, her muteness, again, likewise, doesn't come into play. This is very different from Miss 45, because Madeline is fully able to communicate to the many men who train her in the various fields of interest to her. You know, the men that she buys drugs and a car from, she can communicate with them fine. She has no issues there. She doesn't need to speak to get what she needs from them. And you probably wouldn't call these male allies, but it's, she's a very different character from Thana in how she reads men. She's certainly not really at a weakness in terms of being able to go to men for help and trust men for help. And whether she speaks or not doesn't really play into that. I think that's really just fascinating. Even more importantly, I think the avenging Madeline isn't sexualized or kind of configured as this sort of silent vamp in the way that other avenging women in Rape Revenge are. And again, Thana is a really obvious parallel there because her muteness is represented in such a strikingly different way. But it's not just, you know, women who are presented as having, and as not speaking, right? I mean, this idea that you turn into an avenging woman, and that sort of makes you this sort of seductive vamp figure. It plays out across Rape Revenge, right? So I Spit on Your Grave, of course, is a really key example. You know, Jennifer frequently seduces the men that she's going to take vengeance of. And I'm not criticizing these other films for that. To my knowledge, for starters, I don't think that there's cuts of either of those films that have hardcore inserts. But I guess I just want to show the enormous scope of these films, really just drum that into you, that Rape Revenge films are not all the same. They're not all doing the same thing. They're not as dumb as people assume that they are. And sometimes those people are even fans of these films. These are not cookie cutter versions of each other, even if you think they might be. The slight differences can often have enormous meaning on a gender political level. I guess my point here is that across the board, you know, even the Rape Revenge films that we think of as being the most challenging and offensive, there is still perhaps deceptive variation, and at times there's a contradictory tension, even in the single film, and Thriller is absolutely one of these, where you have some aspects that are unambiguously very, very troubling and very disturbing and challenging, but at the same time you have other elements that are actually quite surprising and really doing something very, very interesting. And I love that in these films, so often, you get that in the same film. Before I continue, though, one more thing I would really like to add on this question of muteness here that perhaps might seem obvious, but I think is worth noting directly, is that one of the reasons it's such an enduring motif across rape films, not just rape revenge films, but films about rape, things like Johnny Belinda, is because it makes literal the idea that rape survivors are voiceless or cannot be heard, not just by the judicial and law enforcement institutions that are supposed to protect them, but even socially, by peers and family, the world that you live in. So we don't need to look too far in our own lives, perhaps, or the lives of people that we know, to see this, right? Where the voices of survivors are just not heard. There's just look at the news. The women who had stories to tell about Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby. I mean, how long did those women go not being heard? So this idea of muteness is it's not random, and it's actually quite an obvious sort of symbol, I guess, or metaphor when you think about it. That idea of voicelessness, of not being heard. And again, that's quite obvious, I think, but I do think that needs to be stated quite directly. If you wonder why is it that so many rape revenge films or rape films have mute protagonists? It's like, well, there's your answer.
Stå för snabbt. Sänk ner, vänta och sen. Så. Chill. Så, bättre. Bak. Så. Så sitter ni. Chill. Ja!
Om du kommer fram i en böj här, du kommer in så här och du får sladd, så måste du styra emot. Du håller alltså emot så här till du kommer ut här. Sen ger du en järnet igen.
All right, something that I've touched on a few times already, but I really want to talk about this a little bit more in depth, because every time I see this film, I'm really struck by it, is the concept of labour, of work. So yes, clearly as a rape revenge film that pivots around the really central presence of sex trafficking as a key plot element that I've discussed already, questions about capitalism and labour exploitation really come into play here. But I think it's important to remember that labour and work manifest in other really interesting and significant ways in this film that really warrant further discussion. So if you keep your eye on the clock when you're watching this, there's actually an enormous chunk of this film that is focused very, very, very directly on Madeleine working, not just in forced sex work, which she has no means of consenting to, but also the actual exhaustive physical labor that she puts into learning the skills needed to achieve her desired revenge. Once she makes the decision that this is what she wants and that this is what she's going to do, one of my favorite things about this movie is that it's not just an instant transformation. It doesn't skimp on showing us how much she works. She's not a superhero, you know, she doesn't just go from being this sort of meek, downtrodden, quote unquote victim to being this all-powerful vigilante overnight, right? It's not even like a quick montage sequence. We keep going back time and time and time again to seeing her work. And I love, and I mean genuinely love, how this film focuses on how much work she does, you know, how much effort she puts into that transformation. She really earns it, and that's a really key word here. Being a survivor of sexual abuse and exploitation doesn't act as this sort of magical thing that turns her into this all-powerful warrior woman, right? She makes the decision to do that herself, and she puts in the hard yards to get there. And we see that actually over quite a significant amount of runtime in this film. There's two things that are related to that I do think need to be quite directly talked about. And first, I guess I want to discuss the way that this film really carefully shows that while she's in training, she's still being exploited by Tony and forced into non-consensual sexual encounters with paying customers. The dynamics, the power dynamics of these encounters are unambiguously working against Madeline. And I might talk about these scenes further shortly. At this point, however, it's just not a life that she can magically snap her fingers and escape. She knows the limits of her power and autonomy, and she kind of has to work within her means, right? She tried escaping and that didn't work because Tony dragged her back. So she learns from Sally. She takes Sally's advice and she starts saving her money with an eye on her new life. And of course, it's the murder of Sally, which is a very violent one if the heavily blood-drenched sheets are anything to go by, that totally mobilized Madeline. It's really the last straw before she hits the switch on the revenge that she'd not just been planning, but actively training for. You know, we see her work. The other thing to mention here that I think is really easy just to write off as like a kind of drug exploitation gimmick is the role that heroin plays in her life. And I think in many ways what we see as Madeline enters that second phase as she slowly transitions from a quote-unquote victim into an avenger in the kind of way, I guess, that we're more used to seeing it in a typical rape revenge film, a typical in inverted commas. We almost see her as what's called a high-functioning user, although it's not a phrase that I particularly like, but for all intents and purposes, that's what she is, you know. She's, again, this film is not a documentary, it's not dripping in social realism. I do acknowledge, I think it's important though, yes, it's not that. But we do at the same time need to acknowledge that her dependency on this drug that was forced on her doesn't just magically disappear once she decides to turn the tables on Tony and his clients. She just can't up and walk away because she decides to. She has a significant addiction to heroin, and that is used as a way to control her. And that Madeline herself, as part of her escape strategy, has to stock up, if you like, I think is one of those really small and easily missed things in the film that actually stops it from being this finger snap, hey presto, look at her life change in 30 seconds, There's a really great moment in this film that is so easy to dismiss, but it's where she's thrown out of her karate class because her instructor sees drugs in her bag. And I think it's a really important moment because it shows that her life isn't black and white, right? It's not just this clean line between old life, new life. There's a very strong grey area here. And it's really unspoken, I think, by the end of this film. But this is actually, for me, one of the main things that stops it from being a more clear-cut revenge fantasy, like I Spit on Your Grave. And I think that it is possible to see the film in that light if you're not watching it carefully, but it's not. It's really quite different from that. I mean, on the surface, yes, there is this similar kind of bam, there's that final kill, Tony gets killed and off she goes. And I Spit on Your Grave does that, right? So Jennifer, kind of sorts out the last guy, bam, off she goes in a little rowboat. motorboat. Oh, if I get the boat wrong, Vinegar Syndrome will get letters. So I Spit on Your Grave really finishes with an exclamation mark. The last guy's dead. Bam, done. She's out. This film feels the same. It feels like Madeline kills the last guy. You know, she meets the final boss. Bam, done. She's out. But I don't think it's that clear cut. And I think that it's actually a bit closer in this sense to something like Ms. 45, again, where there's this haziness. You know, it's not as dramatic. Maybe if there's a spectrum, right, in the way that these films sit on a spectrum from eye for an eye, fantasy justice, justice fantasies, sorry, at one end, like I Spit on Your Grave, with something like Miss 45 at the other end, where those fantasies are revealed as not being real, right? They're just fantasies. They don't help. They're actually just toxic and cause more trouble than they're worth. You know, revenge doesn't work. So I Spit on Your Grave, revenge does work. Miss 45, revenge doesn't work. And a lot of other rape revenge films fall on a spectrum in between. This film at first sight might look like it's much, much closer to the I Spit on Your Grave version. I would argue that it's way, way, way up with Miss 45. Because, you know, we just don't know what happens to her. You know, she's in trouble with the cops. She's stolen a police car. She's not been particularly subtle in her crimes. And yeah, she still has this sort of significant heroin addiction. So I don't think this film is as clear cut as we might first think it is, and almost that it encourages to think that it is. But again, yeah, I really want to go back to that point about how carefully this film goes to such detail to really map out the actual work that she puts into skilling up so that she can execute her vengeance. I mean, so many of these films, so many of them, and this is one of the things that is actually quite common. They have this thing where rape is almost mobilized as a kind of like a magic bullet. It basically turns quote unquote ordinary women into these sort of feminist rage warriors, right? They shift from victims to, you know, empowered heroes, these sort of action goddesses in the blink of an eye. That just does not happen here. It does not happen here. It's way, way, way more complicated than that. And again, I think it's really interesting that muteness, you know, this question of disability sits with that in a really, really interesting way, because this is not how disability is usually represented in film. And I don't mean just rape revenge film. I mean film at all. You know, disability doesn't have a great history of being used in a particularly, you know, respectful way. And, you know, this film is disrespectful, I guess, in so many ways, right? It's like I said, you know, there's stuff here that aren't really up for discussion if you wanted to talk about ethics and things like that. But again, you know, we have that contradiction and those tensions. I think it's a really interesting film precisely because it's doing some really, really interesting, amazing stuff. And then there's some stuff that's a little bit, oh, uh-oh.
fan, ska du ha så mycket? Ska du ha en stor jävel?
So I want to go a bit wider here in my discussion about how this film fits into rape revenge film history as a whole, this sort of bigger picture that I mentioned earlier. Before I do that, before I lose my thread, I did mention that I wanted to briefly touch on Tony's clients that assault Madeleine. One of these, I think, one of these stands out particularly for me. I know that sounds like a weird thing because they're all pretty gross, right? And it's not the one you think it is. I think when we think about rape revenge films as a kind of, in general, we think of of male perpetrators, male rapists, and women victims. So obviously, the woman here is not typical. It's an atypical thing that one of the people that Madeleine seeks vengeance against is a woman who has sexually assaulted her. There's a lack of consent there. The power imbalance is very, very clear. But of course, this is a good old exploitation film, and it does what they do. And our director has said, "I'm just trying to make money. I want to make a buck here." So this sort of mildly violent sexual girl-on-girl action. It's not exactly rocket science when it comes to figuring out what the motivations might be to include that. For me personally, though, that's not the most interesting thing when it comes to these clients. There's a guy with the camera, and that to me, that's the stuff. There's so much going on there. I think it's really fascinating. So the more academically inclined amongst us might recall there's a very famous essay by a woman called Laura Mulvey from 1974 called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. That may not ring bells for some of you. However, a very, very famous phrase that she coined in that essay is the now broadly ubiquitous notion of the male gaze. And this is a dominant form of looking in classical Hollywood cinema, as she describes it, that implies an active, sadistic, masculine viewing position. So that all comes from Laura Mulvey. The idea of the male gaze, of course, has been used well beyond Mulvey's original essay and the kind of films that she was talking about. And perhaps only next to something like Carol Clover's notion of the final girl, I would say that Mulvey's work on the male gaze is probably one of the most influential concepts to have come from feminist film theory into the mainstream, to really have just become a kind of general thing that people talk about when they talk about screen culture. But in those sequences with the camera, I actually think of something, male gaze, absolutely. But what always comes to mind here is the work of Susan Sontag, who once called the camera, quote, a predatory weapon, and said that there is an aggression implicit in every use of the camera. I mean, you really feel that in those scenes. He wields that camera like it's a weapon. Like, you think he's going to hit her over the head with it. Like it's a violent way that he uses that camera. It's abusive. A lot of those rape scenes are pretty ugly, stating the obvious, right? It's pretty intense stuff. But to me, there's something really disturbing about those ones in particular because it's one of those subtext becomes text moments, I think, because it sort of implies or forces us to, in a subtle way, but it sort of forces us to realize that a camera is here, a camera is present. And that sort of demands, I think, that on some level, even if it's a subconscious one, we have to register that what we are seeing, which is an act of sexual violence captured on camera for a perverse thrill, this is a fairly undisguised parallel with what we're actually watching. There's a camera there filming this movie and filming this stuff happening. We see this film happen through the eye of the camera. And by having the camera used in the film in that way, I think it really ramps that up. I mean, yes, it is really nasty stuff, but stripping away the distancing, I guess, between audience and camera is really important here. The only other film that really leaps to mind for me that really does that, I mean, a lot of films do, right? But the really big one for me is something like Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. I think there's super interesting things going on here with that camera. And again, I don't think that this needs clarifying, but again, it doesn't hurt. This isn't me trying to rescue or defend this film. I don't think it needs rescuing or defending. I think it stands for itself. But at the same time, I'm not attacking or condemning this film. It is what it is. And I think that all cinema, but especially exploitation film, this drives me crazy. I think that there's a really nasty habit where we tend to try to squeeze films into boxes where they're either progressive or problematic. Two words that I fucking hate, by the way. And we don't pay attention to the grey area in between. And in exploitation film, as I said, there's often lots of contradictions and tensions in that grey area. And this film is just exhibit A on that front. It's those contradictions and tensions that have me really hooked. Not just in this film broadly, but especially the version with the hardcore inserts. Okay, so I've talked a bit so far about how Thriller can be seen in relation to other big canonical exploitation rape revenge films, stuff like I Spit on Your Grave and Miss 45. But it's useful perhaps to come at it from a different angle and look at it in relation to Swedish film history and the ways that rape and revenge have intersected in that particular national context specifically. Now, I've already mentioned Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring and Verbenius's close working relationship with Bergman. Again, he worked on Persona and Hour of the Wolf. I just keep bringing that up because I think it's amazing. And yes, Virgin Spring is obviously a big film when we talk about rape revenge because of its connection to Last House on the Left and in its own right. But, for those of you who have seen the Bergman film, you guys will know that the Bergman film is actually heavily religious. It has a very similar setup to Craven's film, albeit in medieval Sweden. But its conclusion is really about how the vengeance makes the murdered, raped young woman's father question his faith. The whole point of that story is that, the discovery of the Virgin Spring at the end renews his faith in God. It's all about belief, and it's really his story. It's very much an agent rape. The father acts as an agent of vengeance. But that film ends in a very optimistic way, and that he sort of learns that it's pointless, and so many people, I don't want to go off topic here, but so many people have talked about how Last House on the Left takes that basic setup but actually does something very, very different, which makes it an equally extraordinary film. But I want to focus on this question of religion and religious imagery before I guess I dig into the this concept or this point about Swedish film more generally. The Virgin Spring is probably a useful starting point when we talk about this because, religious imagery runs rampant through a lot of rape revenge film. Not to the point that it's a defining feature, but it's really there in a lot of really, really canonical rape revenge films. So obviously, both Thriller and later I Spit on Your Grave have Madeline and Jennifer, respectively, having really key moments in a church before they sort of go on their vengeance spree. And of course, Miss 45. I mean, the really iconic image from that film is Thana, as the sexy gun-toting nun, doing her taxi driver, are you looking at me punk thing in the mirror, kissing bullets, and then going to the party and just going apeshit in her nun's habit. So, clearly religious imagery and religious themes is something that's really, a feature of some of the best-known rape revenge films. And I do think that comes back to maybe not directly inspired from, but we can certainly trace that back to at least something like The Virgin Spring. And I guess, it is that biblical, is it eye for an eye or is it forgiveness? We're dealing with kind of biblical concepts here when we start talking about justice on this scale. The Sweden, of course, is a really... or maybe not, of course. Maybe you disagree. I don't want to assume that you share my idea here. But for me, Sweden is a really, really fantastic case study for a country that shows just how diverse rape revenge is. Much of my stuff that I've written about rape revenge has been heavily influenced by an incredible book called Images of Rape, The Heroic Tradition and Its Alternatives that was published in 1999, and it was written by an art historian called Diane Wolfthal. I can't rave about her enough. I think she's just a genius. So the gist of her book is that although much attention has been paid to the so-called heroic rape imagery of the Italian Renaissance, what she suggests is that when you start looking beyond Italy during this period, you actually start seeing different representations of rape produced elsewhere that kind of go against what was, being done in Italy during this period. That what was happening in Italy wasn't really representative of all of Europe or all art during this time. And she comes up with this banger of a statement where she says that of rape imagery, quote, diverse notions coexisted contemporaneously. That for me is it. Like, that's it. That's the punch there. If you go away from this with anything other than a really clear working definition of what human trafficking is, that's what I want you to take away. That, like representations of rape in Renaissance art, in rape revenge, diverse notions coexist contemporaneously. When I worked on these books, I watched literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rape revenge films. I was really struck by just how true this is. Just to be absolutely clear, there was and is no single or unified treatment or representation of rape, even within the very specific configuration of man against woman rape that I found when I surveyed the category as a whole. In rape revenge movies, just like Renaissance art, diverse notions coexisted contemporaneously. And this is really the main punch of what I argue about these films. If there is a broad cultural confusion about what sexual violence means, and just, think about your mates and talking about this stuff, and sometimes people say something that's a bit, hello, and they're good people, right? Sometimes people have pretty shitty ideas about this stuff in the real world. If we are a bit sort of fucked up and confused and people who are good people can sometimes get it really wrong, these films really reflect, for me, that confusion. They're confused films in a sense, not just, as I said, not just individually, but when taken as a whole. There's no consistency because we're inconsistent. So we go back to Sweden, okay, and we look at, just between The Virgin Spring and Thriller. For starters, we should put to bed the idea that, and a lot of scholars and critics still have this idea that rape revenge is a sort of uniquely American grindhouse phenomenon. It's like knock, knock, knock. I think Ingmar Bergman wants to have a chat to you about the Virgin Spring. No, it's not. It's a crazy thing to say. And again, it just shows a very, very narrow focus. But it's easy to dismiss if you can make these films all the same. It makes it much, much easier to just say, oh no, they all do this. No, they don't. I guarantee you they all don't do anything the same. But if we start with The Virgin Spring, right, we have this, incredibly famous European art film. We have Thriller here, this, equally notorious exploitation film, not just made in the same country, but by two men who actually work together very, very closely, twice for that matter. We can start to use Sweden as a really interesting example of a place where, the cinematic output really defines that diversity. It really pushes that argument that Wolfthall pushes, that diverse notions about rape coexisted and still coexist at the same time, contemporaneously. Now, I don't want to go too far off track here, but I do think it's actually really critical. So I'm just going to very briefly touch on some other Swedish rape revenge films that I talk about in my book, just to kind of really punch in how broad this category is for you. Even in a country, today I think Sweden's population is just over 10 million people. This isn't like a massive, massive country. Yet we have these incredibly diverse rape revenge films coming out of this country. I think it's so fascinating. A really good example is a film by a guy called Jon Donner. He's actually Finnish, but worked very heavily in the Swedish film industry. He made a film in 1978 called Man Rape, or Men Cannot Be Raped. No, I'm not kidding, that is the title. And it's a really weird film to revisit today, which I'm going to hazard a guess that the title alone might indicate to you why. Look, I touched on this earlier, right? There's still today, and certainly there was during the second wave of feminism when that film came out, a very strong school of thought that this was true, that men could not be raped. And, if they could, it was only through the forced advances of a woman to have non-consensual vaginal penetration. Now, absolutely, that is rape. And I don't mean to imply that it's not. But I'm not going to go into detail here and be crude. As I said, I know that there are survivors listening to this. I'm not going to go into details here, but to say that men cannot be raped is a really fucking vile thing to say. Certainly to name a film, I don't think you would get away with that today, and nor should you. It's a garbage bin way of thinking. But yeah, it's a really interesting film because, this was adapted from a novel by, I think it was written in 1975, of the same name, by a woman called Martha Tikkanen, who was a very well-known Finnish feminist author. And I think it's a really important film to mention because it shows again this very diverse kind, the diverse kinds of rape revenge films that were being made in Sweden or have been made in Sweden, and that sometimes even self-identifying feminists can get it really wrong and can be really offensive. Now, obviously, Men Cannot Be Raped is nowhere near as graphic as something like the extended cut of Thriller with the hardcore inserts. But for me, in many ways, I think it's just as ugly and just as offensive, just based on the premise of the title. It's some scary shit right there. And, to state the obvious, when we, if you want to talk about films your mum would know, we just need to go back to the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, right? 2009, based on the Stieg Larsson novels, the Millennium Trilogy films. There was the David Fincher remake in 2011 with Rooney Mara. Rape revenge. That's what that is. I'm not the only person who's talked about it in that context, but very blockbuster, very mainstream stuff there, So we have these very, very different kinds of films that all do fall under this rape revenge umbrella, but are so different from each other. We get this very clear picture just in this one particular national context, just how diverse it is. It's not just an exploitation film phenomena. And again, it's punching in that Diane Wolfthall argument that diverse representations of rape can exist even in the same country, just across a couple of decades. The Bergman film was 1960. So we're not actually talking about a huge amount of time here. This shit is hard, right? It's really difficult. I've been researching this stuff pretty heavily for about 15 years now, and it's just so much more complicated than most people give it credit for. But it's also really important for reasons that I think I've said already. And I think a lot of the discomfort people have for these films is, it goes back to what I was saying, right? I think that we're broadly pretty confused by the gender politics of rape, even those of us that think we're on it, right? We're all still learning all the time. And just to be able to say, no, all rape revenge films are bad and all rape revenge films are offensive, and all rape revenge films are stupid, and my favorite, all rape revenge films are quote unquote not feminist, whatever the fuck that means. Let's talk about definition. No, let's not, because that'll take up the rest of the commentary. I'm not anti-feminist, but that word is weaponized in ways that I find deeply offensive in a whole bunch of contexts, but especially, when it comes to films like this. To dismiss these films as not being worthy of discussion or investigating is pretty much what I rally against. I feel that it's my job to talk about these. It is my job to talk about these, but it's also a great passion. You can hear me hyperventilating. I'm going to pause and have a drink. Calm down. All right, so as I said from the start, I wanted to sort of focus very specifically on this film, but I also wanted to sort of step back and look at the bigger picture. So we've looked at things like, films like Miss 45 and I Spit on Your Grave. We've stood back and looked at how this film fits into Swedish national cinema. I want to take a big, big step back now. Really do a little bit of a Rape Revenge 101 class here, just so that all of this is in context. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't buy my books. You should totally, buy my books and buy extra copies to give to people that you know. That's what I encourage. I might be biased. You can make up your own mind. But yeah, I think that you should. Anyway, I'll stop flogging my books and give you some material. How about that? I'll give you some actual content. If we look at the big, big picture of something like Rape Revenge film, we can actually see why Thriller is such an interesting and really important film from a more critical perspective, as well as just being a banger of a rape revenge film, right? A banger of an exploitation film. So at the time I was writing my first book, and that really started back in about 2006, 2007, there were really only two really major works by feminist film critics about rape revenge cinema. There was Carol J. Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws that I mentioned previously, and a book by Jacinda Reed called The New Avengers, Feminism, Femininity and the Rape Revenge Cycle. But as I said, those books are great. I'm not dissing them, but the real sort of earth-shattering moment for me was Diane Wolfthall's Images of Rape, which is an art history book. It doesn't talk about film. So yes, just to reiterate, it's really, her ideas really mobilized my own ideas about rape revenge. This drumbeat that diverse notions coexist contemporaneously. We get representations of rape in screen culture saying different things being made at the same time. When people talk about rape revenge, especially, like they're all alike and they all do the same thing, it's just, mate, you haven't seen enough rape revenge films. And if you choose not to, that's fine. I don't think that I would never make anybody watch something like this, my God. But you can't say all rape revenge films do X if you haven't seen many. And I have, and I can tell you, they have less in common than they do more in common. And to me, that's really fundamental. That's a really, really basic, important thing that's so often overlooked. I guess these, as I said, these films really just show us how messed up and confused we are kind of as a broader, I would say culture, but it's actually not just my culture. It's an international thing. I look at films from Hong Kong and from Russia. I look at films from all over the world, and there's always this tension. Anyway, I want to give you this bigger picture. Let's go right back. If you weren't already aware of it, rape revenge stories really long predate film. We can go back to at least the Old Testament, things like the rape of Dinah in the book of Genesis. There's a long, very famous story of warrior queen Boudica, for those of you who are up on your Celtic history. And, forget any idea that rape revenge is just sort of this scuzzy lowbrow thing. I've talked about Ingmar Bergman. I've talked about, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. But it's obviously got a very long literary tradition as well. Obviously there's sort of macho novels that became rape revenge films, things like, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Gordon Williams's novel The Siege of Trench's Farm, which Sam Peckinpah, of course, quite famously adapted into Straw Dogs in 1971. But, much more highbrow authors and women have written rape revenge stories. There's a British Nigerian woman called Helen Uyiyama's story. She wrote a story called Sorry Doesn't Sweeten Her Tea. And there's an incredible short story by Margaret Atwood, of course, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, called The Stone Mattress, which is an incredible rape revenge story. Now, as I've written about extensively in the second edition of my book on rape revenge film, women make rape revenge films too. And I won't go into that here, but this isn't a new thing. There's this idea that, there's Me Too and now suddenly women are making rape revenge films. Absolute bullshit. Women have long been making rape revenge films. I think that, if anything, it's only recently that we've actually started paying attention to them. It's only recently that these films have started being distributed and that we've actually noted, hey, women are making rape revenge films. Doesn't mean that they haven't been making them for a really long time. So in film, if we go right back to, long before even sound was introduced, right? Like even then, sexual violence against women especially was long established as a kind of standard narrative device. We can go back to things like, like Birth of a Nation, of course, D.W. Griffith's Broken Blossoms, things like that, are really, really key examples. Birth of a Nation is kind of gross film, it's sort of this sort of proto-blockbuster where the Ku Klux Klan are these sort of weird superhero films. It's a strange racist film. But it's there. We go into the early 1920s, and not even in the films themselves, but just in celebrity culture and, the news stories about Hollywood. The very famous case of beloved, or up until then beloved, comedian Fatty Arbuckle, who found himself in a very, very highly publicized court case surrounding the rape and murder of a young actor called Virginia Rappi. I'm not going to go into details because even by today's standards, what happened to this woman is really shocking and upsetting stuff. Suffice to say that the assault was so violent that it ruptured her bladder, which led to her death. Now, Arbuckle, I need to say this because it's important, he went on trial numerous times and was always found not guilty, but it effectively destroyed his career. So what story, there are other stories as well, but what things like that did is that they really linked Hollywood to this kind of widespread belief that, Hollywood was this sort of hotbed of sexual deviancy and immorality. And that really set the scene for the very, very major changes in censorship that came into Hollywood during the 1920s under Joseph Breen and the Production Code, which kicked in 1934, effectively ending what was called the pre-Code Hollywood era. Now, I'm not going to do a whole history here, but, pre-Code films are amazing. And it's always a joy when people discover them for the first time and realize that actually people were getting away with a huge amount of stuff during that period. Things like Todd Browning's Freaks, these really subversive gangster films, things like the so-called Fallen Woman cycle, amazing stuff. Films like William A. Wellman's Safe in Hell from 1931 is a film that I really want to flag because it's not a rape revenge film per se, but it's doing really, really interesting stuff about gender and power that really needs, a lot more attention. But, things like Johnny Belinda that I mentioned earlier, Ida Lupino, a woman director who's a very famous Hollywood actress, she was sort of this sort of starlet, but she just thought it was shithouse and she wanted to make movies and she made a whole bunch of them that are incredible. She made a film called Outrage in 1950, 10 years before The Virgin Spring. And again, it's not a rape revenge film, but it's one of the most extraordinary films about rape trauma. She wasn't allowed to even use the word rape in the film, but it's very clear that that's what that film is about. And so, if anybody comes at you saying, women making films about rape is new, women making films about rape trauma is new, Ida Lupino would like a talk. Anyway, there are absolutely early precursors to rape revenge cinema. The first episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the very first episode of the first series, I think I'm right there, like 1955, 1954, 56, I think it's 55. It is a rape revenge story. These are not new. It's not like a sort of 70s grindhouse phenomenon. It really starts to sort of form, I think, around that time as a kind of cohesive whole. But we can trace it right back. And there's not a point, I think, where films about rape became films about rape revenge. I think that these ideas were sort of circling around each other for a long time. And again, like Thriller, time and time again, as I work my way through all of these kinds of films, it's just the same thing over and over again. You know, even the most outrageous and offensive stuff can often, despite itself, offer these tiny little moments that are just so poignant, and, you know, they have real humanity, and they speak very directly to the lived experience of sexual violence survivors, of which I, you know, count myself. And with this film, you know, things like sex trafficking and its effects, not documentaries, but there's like an emotional texture that these films can sometimes capture that stands in opposition to their more woe Nelly moments. And this film, again, is Exhibit A because you can't deny that there's some icky stuff in the extended version of this film with the hardcore inserts. And I've explained why. It's not that I have a problem with hardcore porn at all. Like, bring it on. Totally go for it. But when you put that stuff in a rape revenge film, we're in kind of dicey territory ethically there. I'd suggest that it starts to get a little weird. But this film does so much else. You know, that's not all it is. There are just incredible things going on in this film. And you just can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge that art can be confused and confusing. And I think this is art. I really do. And I'm sure that the exploitation film fans amongst you, and if you're listening to this, I'm going to assume that you are. Funnily enough, I think that exploitation film fans appreciate that more than most people who just, you know, sort of suck down endless mainstream shit. I think that we actually have a much more open mind to the hypocrisies and the inconsistencies and the contradictions in art in general. I don't think that we're the media illiterate goons that we often get the reputation for being. Solidarity, my friends. All right, so we're moving towards the end of the film here, and I've previously mentioned how beautifully shot I think that this film is in points, especially those action sequences when Madeleine goes on her rampage. I mean, they are out of this world beautiful. It's like the people involved in making this film had never seen an action film before, and they just took this completely, almost ethereal approach. You know, like I've mentioned, like the pre-Raphaelites and stuff like that. Like it's like, who decides to shoot action scenes like in slow motion, like they're shot underwater? You know, the way that her hair moves, it's just breathtaking, beautiful, beautiful filmmaking. And you know, I mean, that it's, to state the obvious, that is in such stark contrast to the many scenes that we see in Madeline's room, especially at Tony's place, which are very aggressively and very deliberately ugly on so many levels. Again, I keep bringing up how I suspect that this film was an influence on Abel Ferrara and Ms. 45. That final party scene where Thana loses her shit. The way that that's shot in slow motion, again, I do wonder if that was a coincidence. I suspect not. I suspect that Ferrara, who has always been an incredibly film literate guy, I suspect that he was a massive admirer of this film, if not, certainly, he'd certainly seen it, I'm sure. I can't back that up, but I'd put money on it, and I'm not a gambling woman. So Thriller was shot by a guy called Andreas Bellis. Now, he was doing really interesting stuff around this same time. The year that Thriller came out, he shot an X-rated film called The Second Coming of Eva. Thank you very much. It came out just after this. But the film that he made before it, wait for it, was written by Maya Angelou and directed by the very well-known Swedish film critic Stig Björkman, who, amongst other things, wrote a book on, you guessed it, Ingmar Bergman. So Georgia was the film, and it was in competition at the Berlin Film Festival. This was like a proper, fancy movie. And not only did Maya Angelou herself write the screenplay, but she also wrote the music for the film. And it starred, I love this, wait for it, it starred Dirk Benedict, who is, of course, Face from the A-Team. I so hope that you like your pop culture references random and unexpected, because, why not? Why not talk about Maya Angelou and Face from the A-Team in a commentary for Thriller, A Cool Picture? Some of you might have known that. Some of you, I'm hoping, are feeling the joy of the random grab bag that is pop culture. I've got to give a shout out to the soundtrack on this film too, before we finish up here. I'm always really struck by how restrained it is. It's this beautiful kind of electronic minimalist thing going on. And there's scenes where you'd usually find music, there's just none. And it has such a powerful effect. It's done by this guy called Ralph Lunston. And I love that it completely veers off the tracks, that sort of minimalist electro thing. When we get to the end of the film here, we start getting the really quite mind-blowing sort of like, I guess it's like a kind of a cappella choral music with these female voices. There's some distortion, it sounds like, but it's very, very different from the other kinds of music that we've heard in the film. And again, we have such a powerful clash between what we're viewing and what we're hearing. And I think that music especially really taps into something that we get more and more of as the film moves towards this end of the film, which is this enormous sense of the mythic, of the biblical. That there's something out of time about the way that she chooses to kill Tony. It's almost anachronistic. And to me, that fits in so nicely with the timelessness of Madeline's origins on the farm. This idea of her as a girl of nature or a woman of nature that's really established very early on in the film. And that Tony quite violently takes her out of that. But then she returns to this sort of natural world in a very clear way. Like I said, even the way that she chooses to kill him, it's so elaborate and so ye olde. That the horse and the bucket, it's almost medieval, right? She's still got the gun, but she chooses this really elaborate way of killing him. And, I maybe it's subconscious, but it's so hard to look at it and not think of something like the medieval world of something like The Virgin Spring, even though they're very, very different films beyond that. It just feels so deliberate that her revenge against Tony very specifically is drenched with this very old worldy quality. And here we are at the end of the film where we have this incredible shot that I mentioned right when we began with the car going away. So we saw the car arriving in the first moments of the film, and now we see the car leaving, the police car leaving. Of course, the police car leaving now has Madeleine in it. So we have these connections between justice and you know, who gets to dole justice out. And as I said earlier, you know, I don't think that this is not the same kind of ending as something like I Spit on Your Grave. It's not like, bam, last guy killed, she's done, she's out. There's too much, and I don't think it's sloppy filmmaking. I think that there's a very deliberate effort here to make this hazy. And I love this film for its haziness. I love that it's not easy. I love that it's got some stuff that's a bit and stuff that is absolutely straight up incredible. And I live for films like this. I live for talking about them, and I live for you taking time out of your day to hear me bang on about it. Please take care of yourself, take care of each others, and watch more trash films.